Devil Summoner's Soul Hackers is the definition of a cult classic. While it's undoubtedly aged in a lot of areas, it's easy to see why people took a liking to this game. It has a very unique setting for the time, some great art direction, and tackled some interesting themes regarding the nature of humanity and the dangers of technology. All of this was presented in a very grounded and realistic way compared to its contemporaries. And it's honestly a little scary how much our real-life world is starting to resemble the fictitious Amami city. However, something that I was never expecting to happen was for Soul Hackers to get a sequel. The last Devil Summoner game was released for the PS2 back in 2009. Aside from a few ports and references in other games, it seems as though Devil Summoner went by the wayside, as Atlus would turn their attention to the more well-known pillars of the Megami Tensei franchise. It's not like this sub-series was forgotten, but it also wasn't receiving a whole lot of attention. However, despite all odds, the Devil Summoner series recently made a comeback with the announcement of Soul Hackers 2, which was polarizing to say the least. Everything about Soul Hackers 2 looked so different from the original. Sure, the game kept the light cyberpunk aesthetic, but in terms of art direction, gameplay, and story, it was nothing like the first game. In fact, it looked to be more like a reboot than anything. However, despite my reservations, I was more than willing to give the game a fair shake. And now that the game is out and I've had a chance to play it, what do I think? The best word I can use to describe my feelings towards Soul Hackers 2 is conflicted. For every aspect of the game that I enjoyed, there was something else that would leave me feeling either ambivalent or in some cases, frustrated. I came out liking the game for the most part, but throughout my initial playthrough, there was a thought that lingered in the back of my mind, and it took until sitting down to write this video for me to finally understand what it was. Soul Hackers 2 is a game of many peaks and valleys. While it's a perfectly serviceable game in its own right, ultimately, I think Soul Hackers 2 is a bad sequel. And this is coming from someone who isn't even a huge fan of the original game. There's a certain level of expectations that come with a name. Advertise something as a sequel and you run the risk of potentially alienating old fans when they see just how different it is. It's one thing to revive an old IP with a new coat of paint, but it's another to completely gut what made it so unique. And unfortunately, Soul Hackers 2 falls into the latter. In order to properly explain why, I'm going to be analyzing this game from top to bottom. However, I want to give a few disclaimers. At the time of this recording, Soul Hackers 2 has only been out for a few weeks, and because of this, I want to make it abundantly clear that this video is going to contain spoilers for both this game as well as the original. If you're new here and haven't seen any of my other reviews, this means that I'm going to be talking about the plot in detail. If you want to avoid that, then click off this video now and come back once you played the game yourself. Also, yes, I received a review copy of this game from Sega and Atlus. While I'm very grateful to be given this opportunity, I make it a priority to always be transparent. I'm not going to sugarcoat my words just because I got the game for free. It would be dishonest if I let that influence my opinion, and I can assure you that everything that I'm about to say would be expressed regardless of whether or not I got the game early. But first, I'd like to tell you about today's sponsor, Manscaped. Manscaped is the global brand for men's grooming and hygiene products. They offer the best tools and liquid formulations for the big three odor zones: your body, butt, and balls. The first thing I want to highlight from their Perfect Package 4.0 kit is the new Lawnmower 4.0 body trimmer. This is Manscaped's 4th generation electric waterproof trimmer, with skin-safe technology that reduces nicks and cuts on the most sensitive regions of the body. The Lawnmower 4.0 lasts up to 90 minutes of use with a full charge, and comes with a wireless charging dock. These little LED lights on the front also show how much juice you have, and the travel lock feature is super convenient. It even works under running water too. Also included in the Perfect Package 4.0 kit are two products I never knew I needed until now: the Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant and the Crop Reviver Ball Toner Spray, which keeps the family jewels smelling and feeling fresh. And if you're worried about making a mess, then you can rest easy knowing that Manscaped also offers this disposable shaving mat called the Magic Mat that features plenty of creative and funny designs. For a limited time, you can get all of this plus 2 free gifts: the Shed Travel Bag and the Anti-Chafing Boxer Briefs. If that at all interests you, then feel free to head to manscaped.com by using the link in the description, and use the code NAM20 at the checkout for 20% off of your order and free international shipping, so you can start using the right tools for the job. Once again, major thanks to Manscaped for sponsoring today's video. In the somewhat distant future, there exists a supernatural entity known as Ion. This being observes humanity in secret in hopes of one day understanding humans on a deeper level. Over the years, Ion has gathered enough data on human nature to accurately predict humanity's future, which, according to Ion, is incredibly grim. We're shown a vision of a man wearing an iron mask summoning a powerful deity to bring about the end of the world. It turns out that Iron Mask here is a high-ranking member of the returning Phantom Society. To accomplish his goal of summoning God, Iron Mask plans to collect these powerful strands of the human soul known as covenants. There's 5 of these in total, each of them unknowingly held within certain individuals, and can only be obtained once the bearer is killed, which is something that Iron Mask is more than willing to do. Sensing humanity's impending doom, Ion creates 2 new AI programs to put a stop to the calamity, while also gathering more information on human nature. Those being the support-type program named Fig, and the main protagonist of this story, Ringo. Armed with a gun-type PC, Ringo and Fig are sent on a mission to protect the Covenant holders and put a stop to the Phantom Society's schemes. This is the basic setup of Soul Hackers 2, and while it's a very simple one on paper, things turn out to be a bit more complicated than you might initially expect. Very early on in the narrative, we're introduced to Ringo's soul hacking ability. This allows her to dive deep into the souls of recently deceased people and essentially rewrite their code. Not only does this allow her to experience their past memories, but if all goes well, Ringo can actually bring people back from the dead. In fact, our main party is comprised of devil summoners recently killed by the Phantom Society. While you might think that this ability kills all tension within the story, it's quickly established that soul hacking is very risky and should only be used in emergencies. If Ringo isn't careful, it's possible for her to die alongside whoever she's trying to save, which I think is a good way of keeping the story interesting. This is one of the changes that I don't mind all too much. Soul hacking in the original game was kept pretty vague. It was a method used by the Phantom Society to harvest souls to further their agenda. The capabilities of soul hacking weren't fully explored, so it being this radically different in SH2 doesn't bother me a whole lot. But I will say that if it weren't for the name, then these 2 concepts would be entirely different. It's not like the changes that were made in the Persona series, for example, where the shadows in Persona 2 and Persona 4 shared the same fundamental ideas. P2 used its shadows to demonstrate how a character has grown and changed throughout the journey, while the ones in P4 act as a catalyst for the character's arc. I can't say the same thing about soul hacking in SH2, and it more so feels like a new idea that's aping the name of something that fans might recognize. It's a small point, all things considered, but let me just say that this isn't the last time I'm going to be bringing this up. A change that I thoroughly enjoy, however, is our brand new protagonist. For the first time since, I want to say, Persona 3 Portable, we have a playable female protagonist. I'm surprised it took Atlas this long to pull the trigger and include this in one of their modern games, but what I'm even more surprised to see is that Ringo isn't a silent protagonist. Silent protagonists have been a staple of this franchise since its very inception. The playable main characters weren't much more than cool-looking skins, since they were supposed to be vessels for the player to experience the game's world. Mainline SMT has always been about player choice, so the game benefits from having silent protagonists. It's in the spin-offs where things start to get a bit dicey. They keep up the trend of having blank slate main characters, though one could argue that this was to a detriment. Oftentimes it felt as though the main character stayed silent out of franchise tradition, which impacted their storytelling. The Digital Devil Saga games are a perfect example of this, since a certain reveal within the game itself contradicts the idea of having a silent protagonist. The only spin-off series I felt as though handled silent protagonists well is in the Persona series, but even then, you can sometimes feel Atlas's urge to flesh out these playable characters. This is something that we do see on occasion, mainly when another character fills the role of silent protagonist. While Ringo isn't the first voiced protagonist in the series, she alone has convinced me that this franchise needs more of them. Ringo is filled to the brim with character and personality. She's got a bit of a snarky attitude, but never becomes obnoxious. One of my favorite moments in the game is when she gets into a rap battle with one of the members of the Phantom Society, RS. Sure, it's a bit cringy, but I think it goes a long way in endearing me towards her character. But the best part about having a voiced protagonist is that the standard party dynamic is completely changed up. Ringo's thoughts and opinions are independent of our own, which allows us to explore the inter-party relationship in a different way than before. This makes the cast feel more like something you'd see in a Final Fantasy game, and it feels very refreshing for this series. That's not to say that I think silent protagonists should be phased out entirely, because I think they have their place, but I'd like to see more voiced MCs in the future. But hey, check it out, we have a fully adult cast. Can you believe it's been over 20 years since we had one of those? It's cool to see that Atlas is willing to experiment with adult characters still, regardless of their overall quality. But before I go into detail about what exactly I mean by that, I think we should cover the gameplay first. As some of you may know, I'm not exactly too big on the gameplay of the original Soul Hackers, more specifically the battle system. I thought that the unique gimmicks, while interesting, ultimately detracted detracted from my enjoyment. Prior to the release of Soul Hackers 2, I was interested in seeing whether or not Atlus would adapt these ideas into a modern game, though as it turns out, they tossed out the old in favor of something that newer fans would recognize. Sure, what Atlus ended up going with is better in a lot of ways, but unfortunately, they ended up playing it a bit too safe. The battle system lacks a unique identity of its own, since almost all of its mechanics are taken from other games. The core combat system is what would happen if you were to toss classic Persona and Strange Journey into a blender, but forget to add any extra ingredients to give it some spice. What we end up with is something that's technically solid, but lacks any character or edge to make it stand out. Let's start off by giving a basic overview. The core battle mechanics are in line with what you would expect out of a modern Mega 10 game. You control 4 party members in a fight, and the turn order is dictated by the agility stat. Some changes were made to the elemental affinities this time around. Not only have gun skills made a comeback, but light and dark magic have been completely gutted. Instead, we have the ruin element, which is occupied by status inflicting magic. I believe this is the only Mega 10 game to completely get rid of the instant kill spells. Hama and Mudo have been slowly reworked over the past decade or so. The recent games have been trying to put a new spin on these spells to make them a lot more interesting and balanced. SMT4 Apocalypse, for example, treated light and dark magic as regular elements. The instant kill effects still existed, but only had a chance of activating if the caster was smirking. These spells are entirely absent in Soul Hackers 2, and it leaves a noticeable gap in the game's move pool. It's not exactly the end of the world because instant kill spells in Mega 10 games have always been pretty infamous, but I would rather have the developers take a page out of Persona 5's book than remove that magic entirely, especially since elemental weaknesses play a huge part in the game's combat system. The flavor of the week this time around is the Sabbath system. By exploiting enemy weaknesses, you'll start to build up a stack counter in the top right corner of the screen. After every party member has made their turn for the round, you'll perform a Sabbath attack. This sees Ringo summon the demons you have in your stock to deal almighty damage to every enemy on screen. The strength of a Sabbath attack is determined by how high the stack counter was prior to its execution. The maximum number of stacks you can have in a Sabbath is determined by the number of demons you hold in your stock. Normally, exploiting an enemy's weakness only adds 1 stack to the counter, but there are a few ways of increasing it further, which I'll talk about in a second. Certain demons can also learn Sabbath skills that can be used to give yourself an extra bonus, though I find them to be pretty hit or miss. Sabbath skills only have a percentage chance of activating, and since the demons used in a Sabbath are randomized, it's not something that you can strategize around. There's not much decision making going on with these skills. You either use them or you don't. And since these skills don't draw from any resource, there's no reason not to activate them whenever you're given the chance to. I often hear Sabbath attacks compared to the demon co-op system featured in Strange Journey. While they aren't wrong, I feel as though a more appropriate comparison would be the session attacks from TMS, but only like 10 people played that game, so who cares. There's nothing inherently wrong with the Sabbath system, but I find it to be a lot more shallow than mechanics featured in other games. The reason why the press turn combat system works so well is that it has a lot of flexibility. Not only does it reward you for exploiting enemy weaknesses, but the extra turns open up plenty of opportunities for on-the-fly strategies. Whether that be doubling down on damage, playing it safe with healing, or even planning for future turns by applying buffs and debuffs. This seemingly simple mechanic adds a lot of depth to the battle system, and this isn't even factoring in the potential party compositions and the ability to pass turns. The Persona series also adapted this idea in some form with the baton pass system, but it has enough differences to give it its own flair. Baton passing allows you to chain attacks in any order you choose, with each pass powering up the next action. This system gets you to plan ahead in fights, and while I don't think it offers the same level of versatility as in mainline SMT, it's still possible to get creative with it. In comparison, the Sabbath system in Soul Hackers 2 is a lot less interesting. You exploit an enemy's weakness and add an extra counter to the stack, but all this does is reward the player with some extra damage, and as I said, the Sabbath skills don't really do much to help with this. Sabbaths are a very powerful tool for most of the game, and they'll end up becoming your main source of damage. Because of this, the battle system of Soul Hackers 2 encourages efficiency above all else. There are 2 distinct types of turns in this game, those being the offensive turns and the defensive turns. While it's true that this can be applied to basically every turn-based RPG to some extent, I find that this stood out a lot more to me in Soul Hackers 2. If you start to build a stack in one turn, then you may as well go all the way with it, since the damage a Sabbath attacks scale with how high your stat counter is. If you're not in the position where you can increase the stat counter as high as possible, then you should spend that turn focusing more on support. Skills such as Charge and Concentrate, on top of letting you deal extra damage, reward you with an extra stat counter when hitting an enemy, making it an essential skill to use whenever possible. Battles can end up feeling very samey, since most of them are spent jumping between these two states without giving you much opportunity to break free from that mold. Sure, you don't have to fully optimize your Sabbaths, but since the game is built around this system, you're encouraged to get those numbers up. Thankfully, you are given ample customization to give the combat some creative liberties. Rather than using demons in battle, they instead function more so as equipment for your party members. This is where that classic Persona influence I mentioned stems from. Yeah, for a Devil Summoner game, there isn't exactly much Devil Summoning. Sure, it's explained in the story, but still. A party member's stats, skills, and affinity is determined by whatever demon they currently have equipped. There are two different methods of obtaining demons, those being the tried and true fusion system and through demon negotiation. The former is the same as it's always been, but the latter has been heavily simplified to the point where I even wonder why they bothered including it. In previous games, acquiring new demons required you to talk to them in the middle of a fight and convince them to join your team. The demon's personality played a huge role in how you would approach a conversation, and it was fun getting to see their different reactions to your dialogue options. Soul Hackers 2 guts this almost entirely, and now presents this in a far less interesting manner. Recruitable demons are now found solely through dungeon exploration, and you need to fulfill their requests if you want to snag them. This can range from giving them an item, handing out some cash, or allowing them to drain some of your HP and SP. Meet the requirements, and there you go. Demon negotiation is super lame this time around, since it's nearly impossible to fail. In fact, the only time when a demon refused to join my party was because I wasn't a high enough level. Not only is this too simple, but I find that this new system lacks a lot of the character and edge that I've grown accustomed to. It was fun getting to learn more about the demons that you fought, and it required you to play along with their personalities. Sure, it can be kind of annoying, but that doesn't mean the system should be axed altogether. Sorry about that tangent, it's just that this has bothered me and I hope that this trend doesn't continue. Unlike classic Persona, any character can equip any demon without suffering from a penalty. However, the game nudges you into building your characters around certain roles. For example, Arrow should be the one taking advantage of an enemy's ice weakness, since there's a chance he'll earn an extra stack on top of the one he already gets. The same is true for every party member. Ringo specializes in lightning and almighty damage, Saizo uses wind and healing magic, and Melody is meant to use fire and fighting skills. Because of these extra bonuses, it's important to consider which skills you end up including during a demon fusion, since it has a sizable impact on who should or shouldn't equip that demon. Having these guidelines is a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gives new players a basic idea of what they should be focusing on when constructing a new demon. If you're able to fuse a demon with some powerful wind skills, you instantly know to give it to Saizo, as he'll benefit the most from it. But at the same time as this, it runs the risk of having players develop too much of an attachment to certain demons. A problem that I ran into during my first playthrough was that I was unwilling to change Arrow's current demon for a long stretch of time, since I was unable to find a replacement that could cover the same bases. This led into a few situations where his damage output fell behind the other characters because his demon was no longer up to snuff. I would eventually end up giving him a demon outside of his archetype just so he would stay viable. While this solved my issue with low damage output, the thought of me not being able to take full advantage of his ice proficiency lingered in the back of my mind. Chalk it up to it being a me problem, but I've been playing these games for almost a decade now, and Soul Hackers 2 is the only one to give me this fear of missing out. This is a bit weird because I never once had this thought crop up while playing Strange Journey, which by and large has the same core mechanic. Sabbath attacks in Demon Co-op are functionally identical to each other. You exploit enemy weaknesses to deal some bonus damage, though the main difference between Sabbaths and Demon Co-op lies in how they were implemented in their respective games. The only requirement for Demon Co-op is for more than one party member to share an alignment. The more party members you have of the same alignment, the more damage Demon Co-op deals. While this might sound very limiting, the system is far more flexible than you might first realize. Just because you're encouraged to stick to using demons of a similar alignment, that doesn't mean you're forced to build your party in a specific way. The skills you have on your demons are irrelevant, since as long as someone else can exploit an enemy's weakness, you'll still get that boosted damage. Since every alignment has a bunch of demons for you to experiment with, there are plenty of different ways to play through the game. Hell, sometimes it's even a good idea to mix and match alignments if the situation calls for it. But even with all of this considered, the main thing that sets these two systems apart is that the damage dealt through Demon Co-op is supplemental. It's a bonus for paying attention to your team's alignment and provides immediate feedback for discovering an enemy's weakness. Yeah, you can construct your team around this mechanic, but that's only one of the viable ways of playing Strange Journey. Sabbaths in comparison are going to be your main source of damage. Everything in the game's design is centered around this mechanic, and ignoring it would put you at a distinct disadvantage. It's not about whether or not it's possible to beat the game without relying on Sabbaths, but because this mechanic is at the front and center of Soul Hackers 2, I expect there to be more to it. Despite how hard I've been dunking on this system, I don't even find it to be a bad mechanic. On a purely technical level, everything works as intended, and the game is clearly designed around it. In the moment, I can derive some entertainment from optimizing my attacks to get the biggest damage output possible. The issue is that there isn't enough meat for this mechanic to carry an entire playthrough without becoming stale. Sure, the game does try to add some extra elements to the combat system to spice things up. I already mentioned the character customization, but the game also just straight up includes the commander skills from Strange Journey Redux. However, they ultimately feel rather pointless and don't allow for too much versatility, as they still lean heavily into the Sabbath mechanic. To reiterate, there's not much inherently wrong with the game's core combat, but when compared to other entries in this franchise, it's lacking. SMT5 is also a game that plays it equally safe with its combat, but it makes up for it in the completely revamped character progression. Every facet of the game's design bounced off one another in an entirely different way than anything else before it. You explored maps to collect one-time use items that granted access to new skills for either the protagonist or your demons. Not only was this a good reward for being thorough with your exploration, but it provided meaningful player choice that had a tangible impact on how you would approach battles. Say what you want about the story, but SMT5's ambition gives it a discernible gameplay identity, which isn't something that I can say about Soul Hackers 2. Soul Hackers 2 doesn't need to reinvent the wheel to be interesting, but if you figured that if Atlus was going to play it safe, they would at least put a new spin on some old ideas. I think that this would have been a perfect opportunity to bring back some old concepts and reinvent them for the modern age. Demon Loyalty and Magnetite, if tweaked properly, could go a long way in giving Soul Hackers 2 more of an identity, while also bringing it closer in line with the original game. Make it so that demons are more compatible with certain party members, and tie bonus stats or even an exclusive skill behind it. Maybe if a demon has a high compatibility with that party member, you'll earn an extra stack for exploiting weaknesses. This would make it so you have to consider who uses what demon without it having an impact on their potential skill selection. Magnetite could also be implemented into the game without too much hassle. Make it so we can summon one of our demons as a temporary party member. Have the resource drain every turn, with each demon requiring a different amount of magnetite to keep out on the field. Either that, or you can force players to spend a large quantity of magnetite for a Sabbath attack. This will offer some meaningful decision making mid-battle, since it'll require you to weigh up the pros and cons of each strategy. Deal massive damage in one blow, or bring out an extra ally to give yourself more options in the longer fights. I'm not much of a game designer. For all I know, these ideas could suck Mondo dick, but I think that more needs to be done with these mechanics if Atlus wants Soul Hackers 2 to stand heads and shoulders with the other games. As much as I've dogged on the combat of Soul Hackers 2, when push comes to shove, I think it's just okay. It sets out and accomplishes what it wants to do, but it doesn't bring much to the table beyond that. There is fun to be had with the party customization, and it's satisfying to get a big stack going to unleash hell on your enemies. Crank the game up to hard mode and you're in for a pretty decent time, though one that unfortunately doesn't have the most amount of depth. I at the very least had more fun with this game's combat system than the originals. As much indifference as I have towards the Sabbath system, I'll take it any day over good old Go Command over there. But if we are going to directly compare these games to each other, then one area where the original game undoubtedly trumps the sequel is in its dungeon design. The dungeons in Soul Hackers 2 are kinda shit. Okay, I wouldn't go that far, but seriously, what the hell happened here? The dungeons in the original Soul Hackers were actually pretty good. On top of having unique gameplay quirks and puzzles to solve, every dungeon in the game had a distinct visual flair. Yeah, it's a first-person dungeon crawler from the 90s, so the graphics were pretty limited, but the artists worked with their limitations to craft some truly memorable locations. The dungeons in Soul Hackers 2 are an undeniable step back, both artistically and in level design. This is where the game's budgeted nature starts to rear its ugly head. Gameplay-wise, the level structure feels closer in line with SMT4 than with Soul Hackers, and if you recall my video on that game, I wasn't too big on the hyperlinear design. SH2, despite being on vastly superior hardware, still falls into a lot of the same trappings. For most of the game, dungeons are made up of corridors and lack much complexity. There's no real skill to traverse these dungeons, and combined with the repeated level themes, things start to feel homogenized. That doesn't mean there aren't any dungeon gimmicks, since there are a few sprinkled here and there, but it's nothing that we haven't seen before. I don't even find the dungeon design to be bad, it's serviceable. There's fun to be had, and some of the later levels do open up a bit and require a bit more thinking. The final dungeon specifically stands out as being my favorite, both in terms of level design and art direction. The main gimmick here is that you can manipulate these water flows to either instantly go up or down each floor. The challenge comes from properly deciding which direction you want the water to flow in at the correct time to progress. I find this one to be rather fulfilling, and it's a shame that this is the exception rather than the standard. But when you compare this game to SH1, then the original completely blows it out of the water. The same is true for the visuals as well, sadly. The art direction starts off rather strong, with quite a few unique and varied locations. Though, as you'll quickly discover, we're working with limited assets here. Despite the number of dungeons featured in Soul Hackers 2, there are only a handful of dungeon themes. Some of them, such as the subway and shipping district, end up being reused later on in the game without many visual differences. I'm a bit more lenient towards this since these were already some of the shorter dungeons in the game. Repurposing these assets is fine in my books, but I can imagine a lot of people getting visually burnt out if they decide to marathon this game. But where it becomes less excusable is in the Soul Matrix. Fuck man, this place had so much potential. The Soul Matrix is this game's grinding dungeon. It's divided up into 3 sectors consisting of 5 floors each. And while it's advertised as being optional, getting the true ending basically requires you to clear out the entire thing. The Soul Matrix is the pure definition of a good idea, bad execution. To be fair, I actually really enjoy it from a narrative context. This dungeon is pushed as a way for you to learn more about the party members outside of the information given to us in the main story. We get to see glimpses of their upbringings, and the characters take time to reflect on past decisions. We're even shown a potential future for a character once you finish their Soul Matrix sector. This dungeon helps paint a better picture of the party members in a much more natural way than stopping the story for exposition. It also serves as a good extrinsic reward for completing optional content. The issue with the Soul Matrix isn't so much in the context of the narrative, but more so the gameplay because, sweet Jesus, this place is bland. The same issues I have with the standard level design apply here. In fact, I'd argue that it's actually worse. There isn't much in terms of compelling level design on offer here, and every sector shares the same gimmicks and difficulty curve. The first floor starts off very simple and is the shortest of the bunch, but as you progress through the Soul Matrix, the levels start to get larger and a bit more complex. This is fine on paper, but the issue is that there aren't nearly enough differences between these 3 sectors. If it wasn't for the map explicitly telling me whose Soul Matrix I was in, I honestly wouldn't be able to find any differences between them. I'm shocked that no effort went into spicing up the visuals of this place. Say what you want about Tartarus, but at least it had the decency to add some visual variety. This is one of the main reasons as to why the Soul Matrix wears out its welcome as fast as it does. Since everything looks the same, it's easier to notice the repetitive level structure. Even something as simple as changing the color of the background to reflect the character would go a long way in helping each sector feel more unique. While we're at it, maybe build each sector around a certain puzzle instead. Make it so that every character's dungeon offers a separate experience so that we don't run the risk of boring the audience. The only saving grace of the Soul Matrix is that it offers some decent boss battles. That, and you do have the benefit of picking and choosing when you want to participate in this content. As much as I've been ragging on it, I don't even find the Soul Matrix to be terrible. It's just exceedingly bland. I've heard people describe it as a turn off your brain or listen to a podcast type of experience. While I'm not discrediting those who do get legitimate enjoyment out of things like that, I've never been a fan of that sort of design. Unfortunately, a lot of the issues I have with the Soul Matrix, and to an extent the dungeons in general, can be traced back to a lack of budget on the development end. Let's not beat around the bush here. Soul Hackers 2 is a pretty cheaply made game. It's easy to tell just by looking at it that it doesn't have those SMT $5 if you know what I mean. And in the dungeons especially, you can feel that budget start to dry up. Obviously, this is just speculation on my end, but I got a feeling that this game's vision was hampered due to a lack of funding. It doesn't excuse what we got in the end, but if that is the case, then it's sad to see. However, it's a bit hard for me to feel too much sympathy. One of the more contentious topics surrounding Soul Hackers 2 is the Day 1 DLC. The game launched with 5 different pieces of DLC, focusing on bonus costumes, extra demons, money and experience boosting items, an extra difficulty option, and last but not least, the lost Lost Numbers side quest, which features the game's super boss. Now, where have I heard that one before? Look, I'll be honest. I didn't buy the DLC for this video, and I don't plan to get it in the future. No matter how you slice it, Day 1 DLC is unacceptable. It's content that should have been in the game at launch, but was cut out and repackaged for the sake of making an extra profit. While I have been very critical of this practice in the past, I usually end up buying the DLC for the sake of including it in my reviews. One of my biggest regrets was buying the Fiend DLC for SMT5. While I did get my money out of it and thought it was a good chunk of content, it really should have been included in the game as an unlockable extra. By purchasing the DLC for that video, part of me felt as though I was inadvertently supporting the practice, which doesn't sit right with me. Atlus doesn't care about my thoughts on the DLC. To them, a sale is a sale, which is confirmation that people are willing to pay extra money for content that should have been there in the first place. I'm not even against the idea of offering DLC post-launch to extend the longevity of a game, and I can think of some games that do that really well, but offering it day one just feels scummy to me. At the very least, Soul Hackers 2 does feel like a complete experience if you just stick to the base game. We're looking at about 50 hours if you decide to do all the side quests and clear out the Soul Matrix. New Game Plus even offers some exclusive content to add some replayability, which is nice to see. Strange to see a Mega 10 game end at such a low level though. Usually your player level is in the upper 80s or 90s by the end game, but I finished Soul Hackers 2 in my mid 60s. Those are the kind of numbers you'd expect out of a Pokemon game rather than Mega 10. I didn't even get the chance to test out some of the more powerful demons because of how difficult it was to gain experience. Kind of suspicious. I wonder why it's like that. Before I wrap up the gameplay portion of this video, I believe I should clarify that I don't even find Soul Hackers 2 to be a terrible experience in this category. I know that might come off as a bit of a shock, since I spent so much of this script dragging it through the dirt. But that's mostly because all the stuff that I do enjoy about the gameplay is all fundamental shit. I like that there's a lot of customization for the party members. I didn't go into it, but the comps everyone wields can be upgraded through materials dropped by enemies. This grants them access to some exclusive abilities, and there's even a mastery system in place so you can diversify party member builds just a little bit more. Demon Fusion is still good, and the combat difficulty is well balanced. There are aspects that I like about the gameplay and can have fun in the moment. It's just that there isn't much for me to say about those positives, since a lot of it is stuff that isn't unique to Soul Hackers 2. You've probably noticed by now, but I've spent a lot of time comparing SH2 to a bunch of other entries in this franchise. While it's important to talk about how a game stands on its own, I think it's just as important to discuss how it stacks up compared to the rest of the series. In my honest opinion, I think Soul Hackers 2 lacks much of a gameplay identity. It plays it too safe in my eyes, and could have greatly benefited from taking more inspiration from the original game. Really lean into the idea of SH2 being a callback to the classic dungeon crawlers that Atlus used to make. Even if it wouldn't be providing an entirely new experience, it would at least be refreshing compared to the rest of the company's recent catalog. With the way things are now, I find the gameplay to be just fine. Nothing terrible, but nothing special either. With all of that covered, the only thing left to talk about is the story. You know the deal. There's gonna be spoilers from here on out, and if you don't want to hear that, then I recommend you stop watching the video now and come back once you finish the game for yourself. But if you made it this far, then you probably don't care about that sort of thing. So what exactly awaits us in the world of Soul Hackers 2? To give a brief reminder, a high-ranking member of the Phantom Society named Iron Mask plans on summoning a god to bring about the end of the world. He wants to completely wipe out civilization so that he and a select few others can rebuild the world in their ideal image. Wanting to preserve humanity for future study, the deity Ion creates the AI program Ringo and sends her on a mission to put a stop to Iron Mask's plan. When looking at the broad strokes, Soul Hackers 2 has a pretty simple stop the bad guys sort of story. I'm not knocking the game for this, since if you boil it down to the basics, the original game did the same thing to an extent. However, when looking at the narrative of both games beyond a surface level, it's easy to see that these games focus entirely on different things. The original Soul Hackers came out around the time when technology was starting to advance at a rapid rate. The game feels almost like a response to that era, and used the opportunity to highlight the potential dangers that come with this advanced technology. Stuff like constant surveillance and twisting the truth to spread false narratives was at the core of the story. The plot focused on a corrupt organization looking for ways to use the internet and computers for personal gain. My opinion on its execution notwithstanding, the original Soul Hackers was primarily a plot plot-focused narrative that was trying to make a statement on modern technology. Soul Hackers 2 in comparison is less about the plot and world building, and instead focused almost entirely on the characters. Aside from Ringo and Fig, the party is made up of 3 other members, those being an agent of the Yatagarasu named Arrow, an ex-member of the Phantom Society named Milady, and finally there's Saizo, a freelance devil summoner not associated with either group. While all of the characters are unified in their personal connections to the Phantom Society, their radically different backgrounds and beliefs end up being a source of conflict. The team in Soul Hackers 2 is very antagonistic towards each other. For most of the game, the characters would often challenge each other's opinions on how they should go about accomplishing their mission. You can really feel the tension in some of these conversations, and it's up to Ringo to be the mediator. The group dynamic feels more like something you would see in a mainline SMT game, since each member falls into one of the traditional alignments. It's a complete contrast to the cast of the original game. Spookies was made up of individuals who were all going through some sort of personal struggle. This group was unified by their shared interest in hacking and would use that hobby as a distraction from their real-life problems. It's part of the reason why the characters only refer to each other by their code names. Spookies became a temporary escape from those feelings, so it's easy to see why these characters share a connection. Truth be told, I actually prefer the cast of Soul Hackers 2 and find it to be a notable improvement, partially because the group dynamic is a lot more interesting, but also because the individual characters have much more time dedicated to them. I already mentioned how the Soul Matrix is used to explore a character's history, but there are also a few other ways the game fleshes out these characters. For example, every party member in the game has a personal stake in the main narrative outside of the Phantom Society's goals, one that serves as that character's primary motivation. Arrow begins to question the views of the Yatagarasu and struggles to accept their actions. Milady's intimate relationship with Iron Mask is both a driving force for her character as well as a major plotline, and Saizo struggles to reconnect with his on and off girlfriend Ash, who ends up becoming a reoccurring boss fight. Not only does this keep every party member relevant throughout the story, but it gives us even more insight into who they are as people. Soul Hackers 2 also features optional hangout events to squeeze even more juice out of the party members. These hangouts are gradually unlocked throughout the game, and are used for the characters to either reflect on certain events, or to just casually shoot the shit. There are even plenty of hangouts that see Ringo spend time with more than one party member, to further develop that inter-party relationship in a way that feels natural. There are a ton of small optional scenes tucked behind hangout events, which I find to be a good motivator to engage in all the game's content. The narrative of Soul Hackers 2 is primarily focused on character relationships, and there are multiple facets dedicated to expressing this, whether that be the relationship with oneself and their beliefs, or with the people surrounding them. It's even the driving force behind most of the plot. However, since the game puts all of its eggs in a single basket, your enjoyment of the narrative hinges on how much you like these characters. If you're unable to connect to the cast, then there isn't really much else for you narrative-wise. Hell, as someone who likes the main cast, there's still some stuff that doesn't sit too well with me. The world building and themes of Soul Hackers 2 feels a lot less considered than the original game. I mentioned it earlier, but SH1 put a large emphasis on world building. It's easily the game's strongest aspect, and a lot of effort was placed into crafting a believable world that played into the game's main theme. If there was one thing that I wanted from a Soul Hackers sequel, it was to carry on this torch, not necessarily copy what made the original game stand out, but more so put a new spin on this method of storytelling. While this is delivered to some extent, the execution is sloppy. In fact, I'm struggling to understand what Soul Hackers 2 is even trying to say. The stagnation of humanity is supposedly a core part of the game's world. The development of technology has come to a standstill, and society is on the verge of collapse. Unmanaged capitalism runs rampant, and humanity has begun to regress. On paper, this is a natural follow-up to what Soul Hackers 1 was trying to do. It continues the trend of critiquing current society, but updates it to reflect our modern day rather than the late 90s. However, outside of the game's opening cutscene and some loading screen text, this aspect of the world goes completely ignored. I'm serious, this factoid never comes up again in the main story, and when talking to the NPCs around town, they act like everything's perfectly fine. It's the purest example of the show don't tell rule. We're told that the world is in a state of disarray, but there's nothing in the game that supports this idea. I'll even go as far as to say that if you were to go off of strictly the world design and NPC dialogue, then you would have no idea that the characters are living in a borderline nightmare. It's the polar opposite of the original game, where the world itself played a large part in the narrative. An example that immediately springs to mind is this short event where the main character has his Amami City ID deleted. You're unable to visit any shops or access your bank account until you get a replacement. It's meant to establish how people's lives are treated as nothing but data that can be tampered with, or even deleted if you step out of line. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the world building and narrative of SH1 was perfect, but it certainly feels a lot more considered. I'm just curious as to why SH2 initially presents itself as a critique of modern society, only to backpedal on this idea. If the game wants to show us a dystopian future where humanity has become stagnant, then show us that world. Give some examples of how the current state of society is impacting not only our main characters, but also NPCs. The closest the game comes to this is with the character Raven. To give credit where it's due, I find the conflict surrounding this character to be pretty interesting. In the Devil Summoner games, there are two distinct factions. There's the Yatagarasu and the Phantom Society. Traditionally, the conflict between these two groups have been treated as a good versus evil scenario. However, Soul Hackers 2 puts a new spin on this. An ongoing conversation for most of the game is whether or not the Yatagarasu is truly morally superior to the Phantom Society. At first, it's a very cut and dry answer, but as the game progresses and we learn more about their actions, goals, and practices, the line between these two groups blurs. It's clear that this group has ulterior motives, as they desire to collect the Covenants for themselves, and aren't above getting their hands dirty. One of the more deplorable things they do is raise orphan kids for the sole purpose of passing on their ideals, effectively brainwashing them from a young age into joining the Yatagarasu. It's meant to show that these two groups use similar tactics to accomplish their goals, since Melody's upbringing is remarkably similar. The one currently in charge of the orphanage is a man named Raven, a retired devil summoner and mentor figure for Arrow. For most of the story, it might seem as though Raven's only purpose is to provide guidance to the group, but this isn't exactly the case, since at the start of the third act, it's revealed that he's the true identity of Iron Mask. Well, sort of anyways. Alright, strap in folks. So it turns out that the original Iron Mask was actually this guy named Paul Taylor. He was the person in charge of the Covenant project and was the one Melody was in a relationship with. However, he would eventually be assassinated by Raven. Raven would then go on to absorb Iron Mask's Covenant, steal his research, and take the mantle himself for the sake of creating a world without violence. Raven's motivations stem from a personal trauma. You see, the real reason why he retired from being a devil summoner was because he was forced to murder an entire village of people possessed by demons. Wanting to move on from this event, Raven gave up devil summoning and decided to run the Yatagarasu orphanage instead. But as time went on, those bottled up feelings began to boil over. Raven became fearful of the future. He didn't want those kids to go through the same trauma that he did, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. Raven wants to create a brand new world, one where violence doesn't exist so that future generations won't have to suffer. I actually enjoy Raven as an antagonist. He fits in well with the notion that both sides are in the wrong. The never-ending battle between the Phantom Society and Yatagarasu does nothing but bring violence into the world. If I squint my eyes hard enough, then it fits into the aforementioned theme of humanity's stagnation. It's still not reflected in the world itself, mind you, but it's at least something. A world locked in a constant battle will end in nothing but suffering. So if you want to end that conflict, then you gotta get rid of both sides and start from scratch. But they couldn't just leave it there, since after defeating Raven in battle, Fig suddenly jumps in and turns traitor. Okay, I haven't said much about Fig's character yet, since I wanted to save that discussion until now. Throughout most of the game, Fig acts as the party's main support. She's the one who handles most of the technology and is given the responsibility to hold onto the group's covenants. She's a very useful asset to the team, but as a character on her own, there initially isn't a whole lot to her. However, this changes once the group visits the orphanage for the first time, since upon meeting Raven and the kids he looks after, Fig awakens to some sort of maternal instinct. Fig even starts to develop some sort of affection towards Raven, and sees him as a good person for giving the children a safe home and a potential future. But after he's defeated in combat and left at death's door, Fig attempts to soul hack Raven and save his life. Though, Raven refuses her offer, since he sees his failure as confirmation that the world will destroy itself eventually. Traumatized by Raven's death, Fig decides that enough is enough. She absorbs the remaining covenants and plans on carrying out Raven's last wish, not by destroying the world, but by rewriting everyone's soul through a planet-sized soul hack. Fig believes that as long as people have the capacity for free will, conflict will never cease to exist. And since Fig's plans technically fall in line with Ion's desires, there's nothing stopping her but her former allies. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of this twist. Not because the idea is flawed, but because the execution wasn't up to snuff. This is because her motivation relies entirely on an underdeveloped relationship. As I mentioned earlier, Soul Hackers 2 is a game about character relationships. The catalyst for Fig's downward spiral is the death of someone she cares deeply for. In the cutscene where she soul hacks Raven, you can hear the desperation and panic in her voice. Fig completely tunes out her friends and sister because she's so emotionally charged right now. Whether this because she respects or loves Raven is up to debate, but the fact of the matter is, Fig cared so much about Raven that she was willing to put her life on the line to save him. This on its own is a very powerful scene, but when put into context of the rest of the game, it feels unearned. Fig and Raven only share a few cutscenes together, and there isn't much that insinuates a deeper relationship beyond respect. Maybe that was the point. Maybe Fig adopted these feelings of nihilism throughout the story due to the struggles she and her companions went through. But if that is the case, and these feelings are her own, I don't think it's communicated all that well. It also doesn't fully explain her borderline self-destructive response to Raven's death. I'm not saying that characters can't do stupid things while emotionally compromised, but it needs to be within reason. Raven's relationship with Fig needed to be a much larger part of this game's narrative to justify her reaction, or better yet, naturally develop her cynical worldview throughout the story and use Raven's death as the straw that broke the camel's back. The reason why I'm so fixated on this point is because I feel disconnected from what's going on. To me, an antagonist needs a believable motivation to help them feel grounded. Virgil from the Devil May Cry games is a perfect example of this. His motivation stems from feeling powerless to save his mother. He dedicates his life to a quest to gain ultimate strength so he won't ever feel powerless again. Fig's goals and ambitions make a lot of sense, and fits in line with what law-aligned characters generally want in this series. Should we sacrifice our free will for the sake of peace, or do we keep that individuality and run the risk of conflict emerging? It's an interesting discussion to be had, but I can't help but feel distracted since the source of those feelings stem from something that's only somewhat implied. It just makes her whole reasoning and justification not make a whole lot of sense. The final act of Soul Hackers 2 is when the story starts to fall apart for me. It puts a large emphasis on the supporting characters, and if you're not a fan of what's on offer, then I struggle to see you getting much out of it. As someone who likes these characters, I find the execution to be sloppy, which isn't something that should be said about a game's big finale. I can imagine someone who's a big fan of Fig's character being invested in the final dungeon. It's just that, in the back of my mind, I know that they can do better. I guess that's the best way to summarize it, huh? Soul Hackers 2 is not a bad game. If I had to give it a score, it would be a 5 out of 10. No, not the IGN kind where anything below a 7 is trash, but like an actual 5 out of 10, where it's just average. This might come as a shock considering how harsh I've been throughout basically this whole video, but that's because I've been comparing it to the standards set by other games in this series. If I want to play a dungeon crawler with fun and engaging mechanics, then I'll play mainline SMT. If I want a character-focused narrative with a large focus on relationships, then I'll play modern Persona. I struggled to find a reason to pick Soul Hackers 2 over any other game from this franchise released this past decade. What does Soul Hackers 2 bring to the table to justify its purpose? If you were to ask me, not a whole lot. If Atlus wants Devil Summoner to be their third pillar, then they're gonna need to give it the respect that it deserves. If they decide to make a Soul Hackers 3 or any other new Devil Summoner game, then I think it would be a good idea to lean more into that classic design. Take old ideas and reinvent them so they won't feel out of place in the modern day. Not only would this be a nostalgic throwback to the hardcore fans, but it would also allow the game to stand out amongst other Atlus titles. With the way things are now, Soul Hackers 2 is caught in a bit of a tough spot. Old fans feel alienated because of how different the game is, and new fans don't want to play it because it just looks like a worse version of games they can already play. When you try to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one. Look, I'm not some disgruntled fanboy of the original Soul Hackers who's upset that they didn't get what they want. If you've seen my video on the original game, then you know I'm not a huge fan of it. In fact, I'm not even against the idea of sequels changing up an old series as long as it's A, an improvement, and B, keeps the franchise spirit alive. Going from the Persona 2 duology to Persona 3 might seem a bit jarring at first, but they still kept the core of what that series represents. It's just done in a different way. I can't say the same thing about Soul Hackers 2. It all comes back to what I said at the start of this video. Names come with expectations. Aside from a few callbacks, you can make the argument that this game is only a sequel in name only, and by that point, why bother calling it Soul Hackers 2? The cynical side of me thinks it was done purely for marketing. The Soul Hackers name is more popular than the Devil Summoner brand, at least in the West anyways, so just sell it as a sequel to get people interested. But I can assure you that people would be far more forgiving towards Soul Hackers 2 if it was just treated as a new branch of Devil Summoner instead. The Raito games are a perfect example of this. Part of that is because they're just better games on the whole, but it's also because they still kept some of the old gameplay elements, just updated them to work in the context of an action RPG. Soul Hackers 2 does none of that, and it suffers because of it. It instead takes ideas from all over the series and mashes them together hoping that everything turns out okay. Soul Hackers 2 is unremarkable. I played it and beat it. I don't think I'm going to play it again, and only time will tell if it'll stick with me. Does that make it a bad game? No, it's perfectly fine. But this franchise has done so much better in the past, and if we want to keep getting games of that caliber, then we gotta recognize the missteps. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I'd like to give a special shout out to all of my channel supporters whose names are on screen now. It's because of these lovely people that I'm able to make videos at the pace I do currently. These videos take a while to make, so if you're at all interested in helping out and donating, you can do so through my Patreon or channel memberships. I have a few things I can offer in return, such as early video access, a special Discord role, and even some behind the scenes content on occasion. Every donation helps, and if the rewards I mentioned sound interesting to you, then you can find out more by following the links in the description. Sorry I'm a little late on this one. I wasn't expecting to have this much to say about Soul Hackers 2. I honestly thought that this video was going to be a lot shorter than the one I made on the first game, but when I sat down and started writing it, a lot of different topics sort of just came to me. This eventually led to the script expanding to be much larger than I initially intended it to be, but I think that the payoff was worth it. In terms of future projects, my schedule for the rest of the year is pretty much set in stone, and a lot of it is Mega 10 focused. Expect to see videos on ranking every Persona game, as well as a massive breakdown for Strange Journey to cap off the year. I'm going to be taking a look at both the original version and Redux, so don't expect that one to come out until December. I've already recorded all the footage I need of the original game, and recently started my Redux playthrough. Maybe I'll stream some recording sessions to spice it up a bit, but only time will tell. Also, I would like to remind everyone that I have a podcast with one of my friends and fellow YouTuber, That Boy Aqua, called Polar Opposites. It's basically just an avenue for us to shoot the shit about topics that we're passionate about, and it's been a lot of fun. We recently put out an episode where we rank all of the Spider-Man movies, so go check it out if you're interested. You can also find that in the description. If you want to stay up to date with that and other upcoming videos, then I encourage you to follow my Twitter and join my Discord server. Once again, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.